I sat in the hard wooden chair of room 412, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The air in the Fitchburg County Courthouse always smelled like old paper and floor wax. Usually, I was the one standing at the front, explaining complex financial spreadsheets to a jury as an expert witness. Today, I was the target. My husband, Chris, stood just a few feet away at the petitioner's table. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the judge, his face twisted into a mask of fake sadness. He had spent the last 10 minutes telling everyone in the room that I had lost my mind. He said I was dangerous, erratic, and unable to care for myself. He called me mentally unstable over and over, his voice cracking as if he were about to cry. It was a world-class performance designed to strip me of my rights. He wanted the court to grant him full control over my life, and more importantly, the $464,400 inheritance my grandmother had left me. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't scream or cry. I just sat there, wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings, feeling their coolness against my skin. I knew something Chris didn't. I knew that the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be documented properly. I had spent years putting predators like him in prison, and today, I was going to use those same skills to save myself. Chris thought he was at the finish line, but he was actually walking straight into a trap I had set weeks ago. I watched the court reporter's fingers fly over the keys, recording every single lie he told under oath. I was silent because I was waiting for the perfect moment to speak. Chris's lawyer, a man named Brian, who looked like he had bought his suit from a thrift store 5 minutes before the hearing, shuffled his papers. He began reading from a medical report that I recognized immediately. It was from a therapist I had seen nearly 20 years ago when my parents first divorced and my mother abandoned me. Chris had illegally accessed these private records through a contact at the clinic, twisted the words, and presented them as if they were a fresh diagnosis from last week. He told the judge that I suffered from chronic delusions and paranoia. He said that I had been hiding money and talking to people who weren't there. As he spoke, I glanced at Judge Juliet Crawford. She was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and a reputation for being the toughest judge in the state. Over my 7-year career as a fraud examiner, I had testified as an expert witness in 38 cases total, with 23 of those testimonies occurring in Judge Crawford's courtroom. She knew my work, my brain, and my integrity better than almost anyone in the legal system. She watched Brian with a look of intense boredom that slowly shifted into something sharper and more dangerous. It was the look she gave when she realized a lawyer was trying to play games in her courtroom. She didn't look at Chris at all. She kept her eyes fixed on me, waiting to see if I would crack. I didn't. I gave her a tiny, professional nod, the kind we exchanged when I was about to present a smoking gun in a fraud case. Brian kept talking, completely unaware that he was digging a hole so deep he would never be able to climb out of it. He was insulting the intelligence of the very judge who had relied on my sanity to sign warrants for years. "Mr. Nashold," the judge interrupted, her voice cutting through the lawyer's rambling like a sharp knife. "Do you truly have no idea who this woman is, the woman you are calling mentally incompetent and delusional?" Brian stopped mid-sentence. He blinked, looked at his notes, and then looked at me. He seemed genuinely confused. He probably thought I was just some grieving housewife who had inherited too much money for her own good. Chris stepped forward, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, she's my wife. I'm just trying to protect her from herself. She isn't the woman I married anymore. The grief from her grandmother's death has broken something inside her." The judge leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the very end of her nose. "I didn't ask her husband," she said coldly, her eyes flashing with a spark of anger. "I asked you, counselor. Do you know who Chris Grogan is? Do you know her professional history in this specific building?" The courtroom went silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall. Chris's face went from confident to confused, and then, slowly, to a ghostly shade of pale. He realized the energy in the room was shifting, but he didn't know why yet. He looked at his lawyer, hoping for an answer, but Brian was busy staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. The judge was essentially telling them they were in over their heads. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The mentally unstable woman was about to become the most dangerous person in the room. I reached for my briefcase, which was sitting by my feet. Let me tell you how I ended up in that chair. My name is Sarah, and I am 33 years old. For the last 7 years, I have been a certified fraud examiner. My job is to follow the money that people try to hide. I specialize in elder financial abuse. I spend my days looking at forged checks, hidden bank accounts, and the messy paper trails left by people who prey on the vulnerable. I am very good at my job because I was raised by a woman who taught me that numbers are the only things that don't lie. My grandmother, Eleanor, took me in when I was 14 after my mother walked out on us to follow some man to the coast. Grandma was a retired school teacher who kept every single receipt in a shoebox and balanced her checkbook to the penny every Saturday morning at the kitchen table. She taught me that if you want to know the truth about someone, don't listen to the words coming out of their mouth. Look at their bank statement and their spending habits. That lesson saved my life. Though I didn't know it when I married Chris 3 years ago. I thought I was marrying a man who shared my values. He seemed like a successful businessman, a guy who worked hard and took care of his family. I was an expert at spotting fraud in other families, but I was blinded by my own desire to be loved. I didn't see the red flags because I didn't want to. I wanted a home and a partner. I didn't realize that Chris wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for a retirement plan. I had analyzed thousands of cases of financial grooming, but I never thought I would be the victim of it. When I met Chris, he seemed like the answer to every prayer I'd ever had. He was charming, tall, and seemed to care deeply about every word I said. He ran a chain of laundromats and spoke often about building a legacy and creating stability. I was an expert at spotting fraud in other people's lives, but I was blind to it in my own home. I wanted to be loved, and I wanted a partner who understood the weight and the darkness of my work. Chris was a master of the long con. He didn't ask for money early on. Instead, he made himself indispensable to me and my grandmother. He had been cultivating a relationship with Grandma Eleanor from the very beginning of our courtship, positioning himself as the caring grandson-in-law. He fixed things around her house, he checked in on her when I was busy with a big case, and he held me when I came home exhausted from a long day in court. He played the part of the perfect, supportive husband so well that I eventually stopped looking for the red flags. I didn't audit our marriage because I trusted him. I didn't realize that while I was out protecting other people's grandmothers from predators, my own husband was already beginning to systematically groom mine. He was taking notes on our lives, learning our habits, and finding our weaknesses. He spent 3 years building a reservoir of trust, just so he could drain it all at once. He was patient, which is the most dangerous quality a thief can have. He knew that Grandma Eleanor was old, and that she had assets. He was just waiting for the right moment to execute his plan. I thought we were a team, but I was just the mark in a very long and very cruel game. Everything accelerated 6 months ago when Grandma Eleanor passed away. She was 81, and her heart simply gave out one quiet afternoon while she was napping. She left me everything. Her house in Eau Claire worth $285,000, her life savings of $167,400, and a modest life insurance policy totaling $12,000. The total inheritance was exactly $464,400. It wasn't millions, but it was a life-changing amount for someone like Chris, whose business legacy was actually a sinking ship. Chris had been slowly draining small amounts from Grandma's accounts during the final 18 months of her life, but her death meant the big prize. The bulk of her estate, held in an irrevocable trust, was finally within reach. A week after the funeral, Chris's behavior shifted from subtle manipulation to aggressive gaslighting. He began suggesting that I was getting forgetful because of the trauma. He would hide my car keys and then tell me I had lost them again. He would claim he told me about dinner plans I knew we never made, acting hurt when I denied it. It was classic gaslighting, a tactic I had seen 100 times in my case files. But when it's happening in your own kitchen, over a cup of coffee, it feels different. It feels like the floor is turning into water beneath your feet. He was trying to make me doubt my own reality so that I would eventually rely on him to tell me what was true. He didn't realize that a fraud examiner's mind is trained to look for patterns. After the third time my keys went missing and reappeared in a place I had already checked, I stopped being confused and started being suspicious. I knew the game he was playing, even if I didn't want to believe he was capable of it. I began to keep a secret log of every incident, recording the date and time of his lies. One Tuesday, I came home to find a man in our living room I didn't recognize. Chris introduced him as a wellness specialist. He said he wanted me to talk to someone about my worsening episodes. I was genuinely confused. "What episodes, Chris?" I asked, my voice steady. He sighed, looking at the specialist with a pitying, dramatic expression. "See? She doesn't even remember the screaming fit she had this morning before work." I hadn't had a screaming fit. I had spent the morning at the office analyzing a $1 million embezzlement case for the state. I realized then that Chris wasn't just being a difficult husband. He was building a legal case against me. He was creating a narrative of a woman losing her mind in front of witnesses. He wanted that inheritance, and he knew that if he could get me declared mentally incompetent, the court would appoint him as my conservator and successor trustee, giving him complete control over Grandma's carefully protected assets. I didn't argue with him or the specialist. I knew that arguing would only make me look unstable like he wanted. Instead, I walked out of the room, grabbed my coat, and went back to the office. I didn't cry. I did what I do best when I suspect a crime is being committed. I started a private investigation into my own life. I knew I had to act fast before he succeeded in isolating me. I went straight to my workstation and pulled up a private database. If Chris wanted to play in the world of evidence and testimony, he was playing on my home turf. I was going to find out exactly what he was hiding. And I was going to do it with the cold precision of a forensic audit. The first thing I did was look into our personal finances. Since Chris had been hiding the mail, I used my access as a spouse to pull our joint tax returns and credit reports. What I found made my blood run cold. Chris didn't own a chain of successful laundromats. He owned a mountain of debt. He owed over $320,000 to various creditors, and his business accounts were deep in the red. He had been using new high-interest loans to pay off old ones for years, creating a classic Ponzi scheme structure. He was less than 2 weeks away from total financial collapse when Grandma Eleanor died. The timing of her death was his only lifeline. He didn't love me. He loved the equity in my grandmother's house and the liquidity of her savings. But he couldn't just ask for it, because Grandma had been smart. She had put the bulk of her money in an irrevocable trust that only I could control as the sole trustee and beneficiary. To get to it, he had to remove me from the equation entirely by having me declared incompetent so he could be appointed as my conservator and successor trustee. I felt sick realizing that our entire marriage had been a financial strategy for him. I also realized that he had been intercepting my mail to hide the past due notices. I found a hidden folder in the trunk of his car filled with final warnings from banks and personal loan sharks. The man I shared a bed with was a predator who viewed me as a paycheck. I knew I couldn't trust anything he said ever again. I stayed quiet for the next few weeks. I stayed in the house and played the role of the confused and tired wife while I worked late into the night. I found that Chris had been accessing my old medical records from my childhood. He had a friend who worked at the county hospital, who had illegally pulled my files from 20 years ago. He was taking my past grief and weaving it into a weapon to use in court. But I also found something he didn't expect. I began a forensic audit of Grandma Eleanor's personal savings accounts from the last 18 months of her life. I found 12 large cash withdrawals, all totaling $47,850. These were not expenses a woman like Eleanor would ever have. She lived on tea, toast, and her garden. I tracked the dates of those withdrawals and cross-referenced them with my own calendar and Chris's work schedule. Every single one of them happened on a day when Chris had volunteered to take Grandma out for a nice lunch or help her with errands, while I was working on intensive cases that kept me at the office late. He had been stealing from her systematically during the final year and a half of her life, using forged documents to bypass the bank's security protocols. He was a thief long before he became my husband. I realized he must have been using her foggy days, when her mild cognitive decline made her more vulnerable, to get her to sign withdrawal slips for him. My heart broke for her, imagining her sitting at a lunch table with him, thinking he was a kind grandson-in-law, while he was literally robbing her blind. I vowed that he wouldn't get a single penny more. I began to compile a massive digital folder of every transaction, every date, and every lie. The gaslighting at home got much worse as the court date approached. Chris started finding prescription pills in my purse that I had never seen before. He told my boss at the firm that I was having a complete nervous breakdown and was no longer fit to handle sensitive files. Because of the high-stakes nature of my work, my firm was forced to put me on administrative leave until the legal matter was settled. They couldn't risk a fraud examiner whose own sanity was being questioned in an official legal filing. Before I was locked out of my systems, I mirrored all the relevant data onto an encrypted private drive. By suspending me from active casework, he took away my power, my income, and my daily sense of purpose. He thought he had me trapped and isolated. He even started telling our mutual friends that I was seeing people and talking to the walls. He was so convincing that some of our neighbors started looking at me with genuine pity when I walked to the mailbox. I felt the walls of my own life closing in, but I kept my focus like a laser. I knew that he was overplaying his hand. Predators always get greedy, and greedy people always make mistakes. I needed the ultimate proof, something that would prove he wasn't just a bad husband, but a career criminal. I decided to head to Eau Claire to Grandma's house. I told Chris I was going to visit a friend, but I was actually going to look for the one thing I knew he had missed. I had to find where Grandma kept her secret records. I drove to the bank in Eau Claire where Grandma Eleanor had kept her safe deposit box for 30 years. Chris didn't know about this box because it wasn't listed in the primary papers he had found in her desk. The bank manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Higgins, knew me well. She left a very specific note that only you were to have access, Sarah, she said, her voice low and respectful. She led me into the vault, and my hands trembled as I turned the key. Inside the box, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a small brown leather journal and a notarized power of attorney document. I sat in a small private room in the back of the bank and began to read. My grandmother's handwriting was shaky but clear, filled with the wisdom of a woman who knew she was being hunted. She had started writing in it the moment she realized Chris was trying to trick her. Chris came by again today. One entry from 18 months ago read, "He asked me to sign a paper for the roof repairs. But the paper said something else entirely. He thinks I am old and blind because I move slowly. I am not. I signed it with a slight squiggle in my middle name so Chris will know it wasn't really me." I felt a sob catch in my throat. She had been fighting him in her own quiet way from the very beginning of his scheme, leaving me a trail of breadcrumbs to follow. She had even documented the exact amounts he had coerced out of her savings while she was still alive, and the dates matched my forensic audit perfectly. The journal was a legal nightmare for Chris. It described in detail how he would bring her stacks of papers to sign when she was exhausted or right after he had given her cold medicine that made her feel sleepy and confused. He had been trying to get her to sign over the deed to her house for months before she died. But the most shocking part was the power of attorney I found tucked in the back. It was dated 2 years ago, supposedly giving Chris full control over her finances. I looked at the notary stamp on the bottom of the page. It belonged to a man named Arthur Vance. I recognized that name instantly. I had investigated a massive fraud case involving Arthur Vance 5 years ago. He was a retired notary who had his official stamp stolen by a group of identity thieves in 2019. He hadn't notarized a single document in over 5 years, and his commission had been officially revoked. Chris had somehow gotten his hands on that deactivated stamp to forge a legal document so he could drain my grandmother's personal accounts without my knowledge while she was dying. He hadn't just been greedy, he had committed a high-level felony. This wasn't just a civil case anymore, this was a criminal one. Chris had used a stolen government instrument to commit fraud and elder abuse. I took high-resolution photos of every single page of that journal and the forged document. I sent them to a secure cloud server that Chris couldn't access. I finally had the receipts Grandma always talked about. Now, I just had to decide when to show them. I also discovered a secret that Chris had buried deep in his past. Using my professional resources and a few favors from colleagues in other states, I tracked down his history before he moved to Fitchburg. Chris had been married once before in Pennsylvania under a slightly different middle name. His first wife, Rebecca, had died under unfortunate circumstances involving a fall down the stairs, and her estate had been completely drained by Chris before her body was even cold. There was no proof of foul play in her death at the time, but the financial pattern I saw on my screen was identical to what he was doing to me. Chris was a serial financial predator. He moved from state to state, finding women with assets and no local family, and systematically destroying them for their money. He had even left behind a daughter from that marriage, a girl named Merlin, whom he had completely abandoned after draining Rebecca's life insurance policy. I reached out to Merlin, and she sent me a notarized statement detailing how he had stolen her college fund and disappeared without a trace, leaving her to live with relatives. She also shared disturbing details about how her mother had become increasingly forgetful and clumsy in the months before her death. He hadn't counted on me having a grandmother who was as sharp as a tack until the very end, and he certainly hadn't counted on me being a certified fraud examiner who knew how to dig up buried bones. He thought I was an easy mark because I was just a wife who loved him. He didn't realize that my love had a limit, and he had crossed it the moment he touched my grandmother's legacy. I had Merlin's statement and the forensic audit. The puzzle was finally complete. I didn't go to the police or the district attorney immediately. My professional experience told me that if I acted too soon, Chris would flee or hide the rest of the money he had already moved into offshore accounts. I needed him to walk into that courtroom. I needed him to commit perjury under oath in front of a judge. Perjury is a difficult crime to prove unless you have the evidence in your hand while the person is lying. I hired a lawyer named Caroline, who was a literal shark in a silk suit. She understood exactly what was at stake. We let him think he's winning, she told me during our first meeting. We let him file the emergency petition for conservatorship and successor trustee status. We let him tell his lies in front of a judge. We want him to feel so confident that he gets sloppy. And then we shut the door on him forever. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Sitting in that house with a man who was trying to steal my soul, pretending I didn't know he was a common thief. I even let him see me crying over the fake pills he planted in my purse. I wanted him to believe his gaslighting was working perfectly. I watched him smirk when he thought I wasn't looking. He was so proud of himself, so sure that he was the smartest person in the room. He had no idea he was already in a cage. I was just waiting for the judge to lock the door. The night before the hearing, Chris was almost giddy with excitement. He made a celebratory dinner and told me that, once the court helps us manage your stress, everything will be better for both of us. He actually had the nerve to toast to our future together, while he was planning to lock me away in a mental health facility. I looked at him across the table and wondered how I had ever thought he was handsome or kind. Underneath the charm was nothing but a cold, dark void of greed. He was even wearing the gold watch Grandma Eleanor had bought for my grandfather 40 years ago. He had taken it from her dresser the very day she died, before the body had even been picked up. I didn't say anything about the watch. I just smiled weakly, played the part of the broken wife, and went to bed early. I had the brown journal and the forensic audit tucked away in my locked briefcase, ready for the morning. I knew that by the next afternoon, Chris's business legacy would be a federal prison cell. I didn't sleep much that night. I spent the hours thinking about Grandma Eleanor and how much she had sacrificed to make sure I was educated and strong. She had spent her whole life teaching children how to read and write, and her last lesson to me was how to read a criminal's mind. I felt her presence in the room, a quiet strength that kept my heart from racing. Tomorrow was for justice. Now we were back in room 412, and the judge was still staring at Chris's lawyer, Brian. The silence was heavy and suffocating. "Ma'am," the judge said, finally turning her full attention away from the lawyer and looking directly at me. "Would you like to speak to this court?" I stood up slowly, smoothing out my blazer. I didn't look like a woman who was having a mental breakdown. I was wearing a professional navy suit and had my hair pulled back in a tight, neat bun. I looked exactly like the expert witness I was. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, clear, and loud enough for everyone to hear. Chris tried to jump in and interrupt me. "She's just having a good day, Your Honor. Don't let her trick you. She was screaming at the walls just this morning." Judge Crawford slammed her gavel down so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. "Sit down and be quiet, Mr. Hollister. One more word out of you without being asked, and you'll be watching these proceedings from a holding cell downstairs." Chris sat down instantly, his face turning a dark, angry shade of red. He still didn't realize that the trap was about to spring. He thought he could still bully me into silence. He didn't realize that in this room, he was the outsider, and I was the one who belonged. I walked to the front of the room and placed my briefcase on the table. I walked to the witness stand and looked the judge in the eye. "Your Honor, my husband has spent a lot of time today talking about my mental state, but he hasn't talked about his own bank accounts or his massive debts." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the thick folders. "I have here a full forensic audit of Chris Hollister's business ventures. Over the last 3 years, he has accumulated over $320,000 in debt to private creditors. He didn't file this petition because he's worried about my health or my grief. He filed it because he is completely broke and he needs my grandmother's inheritance to stay out of bankruptcy court." Brian, the lawyer, tried to stand up and object, but the judge waved him off with a flick of her wrist. "I'm very interested in these numbers, Counselor. Please continue, Miss Grogan. Show the court what you found." I saw Chris's hands start to shake on the table. He finally understood that I hadn't been confused or delusional at all during the last month. I had been working. I had been doing the very thing I was famous for. I explained how he had been hiding the debt, intercepting the mail, and planning to use the conservatorship to liquidate my assets. I showed the judge the final notice letters I had recovered from his car. Chris's face was now a pale, sickly gray. The mentally unstable wife was presenting a more coherent case than his own lawyer. "But it's not just about the debt, Your Honor," I continued, moving to the next set of documents. I pulled out the enlarged photo of the forged power of attorney. "This is a document my husband used to withdraw $47,850 from my grandmother's personal savings accounts during the final 18 months of her life, while she was suffering from mild cognitive decline and was vulnerable to manipulation. It bears the notary stamp of a man named Arthur Vance. As this court knows very well from the 2021 fraud case against the Vance identity theft ring, that specific stamp was reported stolen and deactivated in 2019. My husband forged this document to rob a woman who couldn't defend herself. He didn't just try to steal from me, he systematically stole from a dying grandmother who trusted him to be her family." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. The court reporter's fingers flew over the keys, capturing the evidence. Chris looked like he wanted to bolt for the door, but a bailiff had already moved to stand directly behind his chair. He was trapped. I explained the squiggle in Grandma's signature, showing the judge how she had left me a sign that the document was a fake. I saw Judge Crawford lean back, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the forgery. She knew the Vance case. She had been the one to sign the sentencing order for the thieves who stole that stamp. The connection was undeniable. Chris was a criminal, and he had brought his crimes right into her courtroom. "And finally, Your Honor," I said, my voice softening just a bit but remaining firm, I have my grandmother's own words from her final months. I held up the brown leather journal I had found in the bank vault. Eleanor Grogan knew exactly what Chris was doing. She wrote down every time he tried to trick her into signing papers. She wrote down the dates he took her money and the lies he told her to get it. She even wrote that she was afraid he was putting something in her tea to make her sleep so he could search her house for her bank books. I looked directly at Chris then. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of him. He looked small and pathetic, like a cornered rat. He thought he could use my grief as a weapon. He thought that because I was quiet, I was weak and easily broken. But he forgot one very important thing. I was raised by a woman who kept receipts, and I am an expert at reading them. I handed the journal and Merlin's statement to the bailiff to give to the judge. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had spoken for Grandma Eleanor, and I had spoken for myself. The truth was finally out in the open, and there was no way for Chris to hide it anymore. I walked back to my seat, my head held high. I had done my job. Now it was the court's turn to do theirs. Judge Crawford read the journal in total silence for several minutes. The only sound in the entire room was the soft, rhythmic turning of the pages. When she finally finished, she closed the journal and looked at Chris. The look in her eyes was cold enough to make a grown man tremble. "Mr. Hollister," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many cases of greed and betrayal. But the calculated cruelty you have shown to your wife and her late grandmother is truly exceptional. You came into this court and tried to weaponize this woman's past trauma and her current grief to steal a legacy you did nothing to earn." She then turned her gaze to the lawyer, Brian. "Mr. Nashold, if I ever see you in my courtroom again with a case this poorly researched and maliciously filed, I will recommend you for immediate disbarment. You have been a willing pawn in a criminal enterprise, and that is unacceptable for an officer of this court." Brian looked like he wanted to melt into the floorboards and disappear. He didn't say a word. He just stared at his desk, his face bright red with shame. The judge then looked at me and gave a small, respectful nod. "Miss Grogan, I apologize that this court was used as a tool to further your husband's harassment. Your professionalism is, as always, beyond reproach." I felt the last of the tension leave my shoulders. "The petition for conservatorship and successor trustee appointment is denied with prejudice," the judge announced, her voice booming through the room. "Furthermore, based on the clear evidence of forgery, theft, and financial exploitation of the elderly presented today by Ms. Grogan, I am referring this entire matter immediately to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. I am also notifying the FBI due to the use of a stolen federal notary instrument." She looked at the bailiffs. "Mr. Hollister, you are not to leave this building. Bailiffs, please take him into custody immediately. He is a flight risk and a danger to his wife's assets." Chris stood up, finally finding his voice in a desperate high-pitched scream. "This is a lie. She's crazy. She made all of this up in her head. You can't trust her." He started screaming and lunged toward me, reaching out as if to grab my throat. 2 bailiffs tackled him to the ground before he could even get within 3 feet of me. They handcuffed him right there on the floor in front of everyone. The perfect, concerned husband was being dragged out of the room, still shouting vile insults and threats at me. I didn't flinch. I just watched him go, realizing that the man I had loved never really existed. He was just a collection of lies and debts. As the doors swung shut behind him, the courtroom finally felt peaceful. I was free. I was no longer the unstable wife. I was just Sarah. I sat back down in the wooden chair for a moment, the adrenaline finally leaving my body and leaving me feeling light and hollow. I felt a steady hand on my shoulder. It was Caroline, my lawyer. "You did it, Sarah," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine pride. "He's never going to hurt you or anyone else ever again. That paper trail was perfect." I looked up at the bench. Judge Crawford gave me a small, almost invisible nod of respect before she stood up to leave. She knew what it took for me to stand up there and stay professional while my entire life was being publicly dismantled. I walked out of the courtroom a few minutes later and stood on the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The sun was shining brightly, and for the first time in 6 long, suffocating months, I could breathe deeply without feeling like I was drowning. The weight of Chris's gaslighting and his shadows was finally gone. I wasn't the unstable wife he tried to create. I was the woman who had brought a career predator to justice using nothing but the truth and a briefcase full of facts. I looked at the city of Fitchburg and felt like I was seeing it for the first time. I had my life back. I had my grandmother's legacy. And most importantly, I had my own mind, sharp and clear, and mine alone. I took off the pearl earrings and tucked them safely into my pocket. We had won. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the investigation into Chris's life expanded rapidly. The district attorney found that he had been using shell companies to hide the money he had stolen from my grandmother. Digital evidence on his laptop showed he had been planning to liquidate all her assets and sell her house the moment the conservatorship was granted. He had even been in secret talks with a real estate agent. He was eventually charged with 12 counts of felony fraud, forgery, identity theft, and elder abuse. Because he had used the interstate mail system to send forged documents, the FBI took over as the lead agency. After a brief trial where he maintained his innocence, Chris was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison after rejecting a plea deal that would have given him 8 years. The prosecutor, a former colleague of mine, refused to offer leniency because of his pattern of predatory behavior across multiple states. They reopened the investigation into Rebecca's death as well, though statute of limitations issues complicated that case. Chris had spent his life stealing from women, but he had finally stolen from the wrong one. His legacy was now a permanent criminal record and a cell in Oxford, Mississippi. Justice was absolute. My firm restored me to full active duty the following week with a formal apology from the senior partners. My boss admitted he should have trusted my 7-year track record instead of a panicked husband's phone calls. They gave me a promotion and raise, calling my handling of the case a masterclass in forensic methodology. My first case back was helping an 84-year-old woman in Kenosha whose nephew had stolen $89,000 from her retirement account. I worked with a passion I'd never felt before. I knew exactly what she was feeling, the shame and confusion of being betrayed by someone you trusted. We got every penny back. Her nephew was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. People think my job is about spreadsheets and numbers, but it's actually about restoring balance to the world. It's about making sure predators learn that someone is always watching the ledgers. I realized my grandmother hadn't just left me money. She had left me a calling. I was the guardian of the paper trail. I moved back into my grandmother's house in Eau Claire permanently. I kept her oak furniture and flowered curtains, but changed every lock and installed a modern security system. I sit on the porch in quiet evenings now, watching fireflies dance in the tall grass, the same way she used to do. Sometimes I look at my grandmother's pearls in the hallway mirror and think about her incredible strength. She was a warrior who protected me even after death. Chris is serving his 15-year sentence in Oxford, Mississippi. I filed for divorce the week after his sentencing, and because of his criminal conviction, he received no marital assets. The divorce was finalized within 60 days. I am 33 years old, starting over on my own terms. I am not unstable. I am not broken. I am not a victim. I am a woman who knows how to keep receipts, and for the first time in my life, I am at total peace. The house is quiet, the bills are paid, and the truth is recorded forever. I look at the empty chair on the porch and smile, knowing Grandma Eleanor would be proud of the woman I've become. I am the daughter of a teacher and the granddaughter of a hero. And I am exactly where I belong. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. There's another one waiting on your screen right now.